It all started on a warm Sunday afternoon, the kind where the sun was bright, the breeze was gentle, and you'd think nothing in the world could go wrong. But I learned the hard way that when Karen lives next door, peace is only an illusion. So, listen carefully, because this story isn't just about revenge, it's about justice. And if you stick with me until the end, you'll see exactly how I turn the tables on the most vindictive HOA Karen you could imagine. So make sure you're subscribed to Sham Stories, because you're going to want to hear every second of this. My name is Daniel Grant, and for 5 years I'd been living in this peaceful cul-de-sac. Or at least it was peaceful until the HOA elected Karen Miller as president. She was the kind of person who treated every tiny HOA rule like it was federal law, someone who believed the neighborhood was her personal kingdom. And from the day she took office, she made it her mission to make my life miserable. At first, it was little things, nasty notes on my door about my lawn, citations for leaving my garbage can out for a few hours too long, complaints about the color of my front door. I ignored her, thinking she'd eventually get bored, but she only escalated. Karen wasn't just a busybody. She was calculating. I later learned she wanted my property, which sat on a corner lot with the best view of the valley. She'd been pushing the HOA to buy it, but since they didn't have the funds, her next step was to try to force me out. She filed bogus violations, racked up fines, and even tried to get my bank involved by claiming I was in breach of HOA contract. I fought each accusation, kept meticulous records, and didn't back down, which drove her insane. But I never expected she'd cross the line from harassment into outright criminal destruction. The week before it happened, I noticed Karen lingering around my property more than usual. One night, I caught her taking photos of my backyard from the sidewalk. When I asked what she was doing, she smirked and said, "Just making sure you're in compliance?" I brushed it off, but something about the way she said it sent a chill down my spine. Then came Friday night. I was away visiting my sister 2 towns over. When I got the call at 2:37 a.m. from my neighbor Jeff, my heart sank. "Daniel, your house, it's on fire. You need to get here now," he said, his voice trembling. I raced back, speeding down the highway like my life depended on it, and when I turned onto my street, I saw flashing red and blue lights reflecting off the houses. Fire trucks were everywhere, firefighters dousing the smoldering remains of what used to be my home. The roof had collapsed, the windows shattered, and black smoke poured into the night sky. I staggered forward, numb, unable to process the sight. A fire marshal approached me, asking about insurance and the last time I'd been home. They suspected arson almost immediately. There were signs of gasoline smells still lingering in the air, burn patterns indicating the fire started in multiple places. But the police didn't have enough to name a suspect that night. I knew in my gut who had done it, though. Karen was standing on the sidewalk, wrapped in a blanket, sipping coffee like she was watching a morning show. When our eyes met, she smiled. Not a sympathetic smile, but a smug, satisfied grin that made my blood boil. She even had the nerve to walk over and say, "So sorry about your house, Daniel. Maybe now you'll consider selling." That was it. Any doubt I had vanished. She had finally gone too far, and I was going to make her pay. The next morning, I called my friend Mark, a private investigator who owed me a favor from years ago when I helped him with a legal matter. I told him everything, and he agreed to dig into Karen's movements that night. Within 48 hours, he had surveillance footage from a gas station 2 miles away, showing Karen filling 2 large red gas cans at 11:47 p.m. Not only that, but she was wearing the same clothes neighbors described, seeing her in shortly before the fire started. That footage was enough for the police to bring her in for questioning. She denied everything, claiming the gas was for her lawn equipment. But her story had holes big enough to drive a fire truck through. Still, without direct evidence placing her at my house, the DA wasn't ready to press charges. That's when I realized if I wanted justice, I'd have to do more than just sit back and wait. I'd have to take her to court myself. I met with my attorney, Rachel Porter, one of the sharpest civil litigators in the state. When I laid out the evidence, she smiled and said, "Daniel, we're going to own her. She thinks she can get away with this. She's in for a rude awakening." We filed a civil lawsuit for arson, destruction of property, and emotional distress. The court date was set for 3 weeks later, but in the meantime, Karen kept acting like she was untouchable. She even posted in the HOA Facebook group, "Some people just can't handle the rules and are quick to play the victim." I stayed quiet publicly, but privately I was building a case so airtight she wouldn't be able to wriggle out of it. Mark uncovered more credit card receipts, showing she bought fire starter logs the day before the fire. Text messages she'd sent to another HOA board member saying, "Daniel's going to regret ignoring my warnings." We subpoenaed those messages, and they were damning. By the time the first court hearing arrived, my legal arsenal was loaded. The morning of the hearing, I walked into the courthouse with Rachel by my side. And there she was, Karen Miller, dressed like she was attending a brunch, not a trial, her smug grin still plastered on her face. She didn't know it yet, but she was about to walk into the fight of her life, and for once, I had the upper hand. The investigation into the fire seemed straightforward at first, at least from my perspective. My house was nothing but a smoldering skeleton of charred wood, warped beams, and ash, but the cause was obvious. An accelerant had been used. Fire marshal had no trouble finding traces of gasoline in the rubble, and security cameras from a neighbor's property caught the faint silhouette of a figure walking toward my house late at night. The shape, the posture, and even the walk were unmistakable to me. It was Karen, but she had worn a hoodie and gloves, trying to conceal herself, and the footage was grainy enough that she could deny it was her. Still, the police took my statement and collected what evidence they could. I was seething, but I knew that rushing things would only give her an escape route. She was confident, too confident. When I ran into her 2 days later, standing smugly at the HOA office, she gave me a sickly sweet smile and said, "Shame about your house, Mark. Some people just don't take fire safety seriously." She wanted me to lose my temper in public, to make myself look unstable, but I bit my tongue so hard I could taste blood. My lawyer, Daniel, had already warned me, if I wanted her behind bars, I had to let her make the mistakes, not me. Over the next few days, the HOA board's behavior shifted in a way that confirmed my suspicions. They didn't just avoid talking about the fire. They acted like it was my fault. Memos were sent to residents implying that my property had been poorly maintained, that unsafe wiring was to blame, and that external parties weren't responsible. Corin even stood up at an HOA meeting and said, with mock sincerity, that she hoped all of us learned from this tragedy about keeping our homes safe. The gall of that woman was staggering. But I wasn't the only one who saw through it. Quietly, one by one, neighbors who had been fed up with Karen's bullying started slipping me little bits of information. Someone overheard her bragging on the phone about finally dealing with Mark once and for all. Another neighbor mentioned seeing her in the days before the fire moving boxes out of her garage late at night. A third even hinted that they knew about her secret storage unit outside of town. I made notes of everything and passed it along to Daniel. We agreed that the key to nailing her would be linking her to the accelerant. That meant finding proof she'd purchased gasoline in suspicious quantities. Through a legal request, Daniel got hold of credit card transaction logs for the HOA's official account and for Karen's personal account. That's when things got interesting. A week before the fire, Karen had bought several 5-gallon gas cans and filled them at a station on the outskirts of town. The purchase was large enough that the clerk remembered her, even describing the floral scarf she wore over her hair. That scarf was something I'd seen her wear 100 times. 2 HOA meetings. Still, Daniel cautioned me. We can't just rely on that. She claimed it was for lawn equipment or an HOA landscaping project. So we dug deeper. I hired a private investigator, Mike, who specialized in HOA corruption cases. He had a way of making people talk. Within days, he tracked down a maintenance worker who claimed Karen had tried to pay him to accidentally damage my property a month before the fire. He refused, but he remembered her words. "If you don't do it, I'll find someone who will." This was gold, but we still needed something concrete tying her to that night. Then came the break I'd been hoping for. The neighbor whose security camera caught the shadowy figure realized they had an old dash cam in their truck that also pointed toward the street. That footage, though partially obstructed, captured Karen's car pulling up near my driveway just minutes before the flames appeared. The timestamp matched the fire marshal's estimated start time almost perfectly. Now we had movement, motive, and method, but the case wasn't open and shut yet. Karen had powerful allies in the HOA board, and she was already spinning a narrative that I was obsessed with her and trying to smear her reputation. It was disgusting, but Daniel reassured me that in court, the evidence would speak louder than her lies. I tried to go about my life, living temporarily in a small rental while sorting through insurance claims. But Karen couldn't help herself. She had to gloat. She left a note taped to my temporary mailbox. Bet you wish you'd just sold. To us, when you had the chance, that note was the stupidest move she'd made yet. I gave it straight to Daniel, who added it to the growing stack of evidence. By the time the court date was set, we had a binder full of damning material, gas purchase receipts, witness statements, camera footage, and the threatening note. Still, I could see Karen walking around the neighborhood with that same smug grin, as if she knew she was untouchable. But what she didn't know was that I had one final piece of evidence up my sleeve. Something I'd kept quiet about, even from Daniel, until the right moment. It wasn't just about proving she'd set the fire, it was about proving the motive went beyond spite. She didn't just want me gone, she wanted the land my house sat on, a piece of property the HOA had been eyeing for years to expand there. Lakefront Park. And in the middle of that expansion plan was Karen's name in big, bold letters as the one who would oversee the project. That meant money, power, and prestige. The fire was just her way of removing the last obstacle. I planned to drop that bombshell in court when she least expected it. And when the day finally came, and I saw her strut into the courtroom in a bright red suit like she was walking a runway, I knew this was the moment everything would turn. The next morning, the crisp autumn air bit at my skin as I stepped out of my temporary rental cabin and walked toward my truck. Clutching the thick case file under my arm like it was an anchor, keeping me from drifting into the rage I'd been holding back for days. I had spent most of the night combing through legal precedents, eyewitness statements, and the fragments of surveillance data I'd managed to recover from my home security system. I was building the kind of case you didn't just win, you buried the opposition with it. Karen wasn't dealing with a neighbor anymore. She was dealing with someone who knew every rule, every loophole, and every possible way to make her answer for what she'd done. The destruction of my home wasn't going to be brushed off as a neighborhood incident or accidental fire. Not on my watch. I headed into the city to meet with Detective Harris again. He had called late last night saying he'd made some progress, but he wouldn't share details over the phone. I found him at his desk, surrounded by open files, with a cup of coffee that had clearly been reheated too many times. He motioned for me to sit, sliding a folder across the desk. Inside were a series of photos taken from a security camera on the opposite street from my house, facing the tree line. The images weren't perfect grainy from the distance, but they were clear enough to make my blood boil. There she was, Karen, dressed in dark clothing. Her HOA badge clipped brazenly to her jacket, walking with two other people toward my property the night of the fire. One of them carried a red gasoline can. My jaw clenched so hard I thought my teeth might crack. "This is enough to get a warrant," Harris said quietly. "But I want you to understand something, this isn't just an arson charge anymore." With her position in the HOA, there are corruption angles, conspiracy charges, maybe even racketeering if we dig deep enough. My legal brain was already moving faster than my emotions could keep up. Racketeering meant uncovering the HOAs. Other operations, legal ones. And if Karen was as arrogant as I knew her to be, she'd have left a trail wide enough to drive a semi through. I told Harris to proceed with the warrant, but asked him to hold off on any arrests for 48 hours. I needed that time to put together the rest of the puzzle and make sure that when she was finally in cuffs, she'd stay there. On the drive back, I called Rachel, an old law school friend who now specialized in property crimes and civil suits. She picked up on the first ring, her voice sharp and ready. "I heard about the fire. Tell me you're going after her." I laid out the situation in detail, and by the time I finished, she was already setting up a meeting for that evening. We agreed to meet at her office downtown, where the dim lighting and soundproof walls made it feel like plotting inside a war room. Rachel's desk was covered with printed copies of HOA bylaws from Karen's community, and I immediately noticed the patterns. The rules were written in vague, manipulative language designed to give the board complete control over what homeowners could and couldn't do, all under the guise of community standards. That meant Karen could easily have used those rules as leverage against others before me. I started digging into public records, searching for anyone who had recently been fined, threatened with property seizure, or pressured into selling. Within an hour, we had a list of 7 homeowners who'd either lost their properties to foreclosure or sold them at suspiciously low prices in the past year, all in the same HOA. That was the crack in the armor we needed. I knew Karen. She wasn't just burning my house for revenge. She was running a game, a profitable one, and my home had been a piece of her bigger puzzle. That night, I drove past my old street, parking far enough away not to be seen. My home was nothing more than blackened rubble, the air still faintly carrying the smell of smoke. But there were signs of fresh activity, tire tracks in the dirt where the lawn had been, and a property under review sign stuck in the ground like some kind of sick trophy. I snapped photos from a distance and sent them to Rachel. It was proof that Karen was moving in fast to claim the land. The next day, I began making house calls to the 7 other homeowners from our list. One by one, their stories unfolded with chilling similarity: fake violations, escalating fines, threats of foreclosure, and in one case, a suspicious electrical fire that had forced the owners to sell at a fraction of market value. Karen was at the center of every single case, always using her HOA authority to pressure them out. Before the properties ended up in the hands of developers she seemed unusually connected to. By the time I reached the last homeowner, an elderly man named Peter, I was already certain of the scope of her operation. Peter's voice shook as he described how Karen had come to his house the night before his own fire, warning him that bad things happen when people don't cooperate. That was the smoking gun, a verbal threat directly tied to property damage. I recorded the entire conversation with his permission, knowing it could be the tipping point in court. Over the next 48 hours, my plan solidified. Harris and his team were ready to execute the warrant. Rachel had drafted the initial complaint for a civil suit that would not only demand damages, but seek to dismantle the HOA leadership entirely under charges of fraud and abuse of power. And I had lined up every victim willing to testify. Timing had to be perfect. On the morning of the 3rd day, we struck. Harris's team raided the HOA office while I stood across the street, watching through the glass as Karen's smug face morphed into shock. She was escorted out in handcuffs, still trying to talk her way out of it. But this was only the first battle. Arresting her was one thing. Making sure she couldn't slither free was another. I knew Karen. She'd lawyer up fast, probably with someone equally ruthless. I'd have to be twice as prepared for the courtroom showdown that was coming. That night, back in my rental cabin, I sat at the small kitchen table, my laptop glowing in the dim light. I wasn't just building a case anymore. I was preparing to crush an entire corrupt network. Karen had walked into this war thinking she was untouchable, but she had no idea she'd picked the wrong person to burn. And soon, she'd find herself standing in the one place she couldn't twist the rules: my courtroom. By the time the day of the pretrial hearing arrived, my nerves were taut, but my determination was sharper than it had ever been. The courthouse steps felt like they stretched into the sky as I climbed them, the heavy doors creaking open to a marble-floored lobby that echoed with the sounds of shuffling papers, clicking heels, and the faint hum of whispered conversations. The prosecutor had warned me that Karen's defense attorney was going to be aggressive, but I had no idea just how deep they'd try to dig. While I took my seat at the plaintiff's table, I noticed Karen across the aisle, dressed not in her usual smug HOA blazer, but in a subdued navy suit, hair tied back in a tight bun, and a facial expression that looked carefully constructed to project innocence. She didn't look at me at first, pretending instead to shuffle through documents. But when our eyes met, there was a split-second crack in her composure that told me she still thought she had an angle to play. The judge entered. The room stood in unison. Stern eyes swept over us as he settled in. The first order of business was to go over the evidence that both sides had submitted. I sat motionless as my attorney presented photographs of the charred remains of my home, side by side with the video stills from my neighbor's security cameras showing a figure Karen lurking near my property that night, carrying something that looked very much like a gas can. Her attorney immediately objected, claiming the image was too grainy to be definitive, but the judge overruled him. The prosecutor then introduced the fire department's report, which described multiple points of ignition and traces of making it clear the fire had been deliberately set. I stole a glance at Karen. Her jaw was tighter now, and her hand clenched around her pen until her knuckles were pale. When it was the defense's turn, they came at me hard. The attorney implied that I had a history of disputes with neighbors, painting me as a difficult resident who might be framing Karen out of spite. They even brought up old HOA meeting minutes where I'd opposed several of Karen's initiatives, none of which had anything to do with burning down a house. My attorney objected repeatedly, pointing out that the defense was relying on character assassination rather than actual evidence. And for the most part, the judge seemed to agree. Still, the defense managed to plant seeds of doubt, suggesting the fire could have been the work of an unknown vandal or a random arsonist. Midway through the proceedings, the judge called for a short recess. I stepped out into the hallway to get some air, the sterile scent of the courthouse mixing with the faint smell of coffee from a nearby vending machine. That's when Karen herself approached me, her heels clicking sharply against the tile. Stopped a few feet away, looking around to make sure no one was too close, and in a voice so low I could barely hear, she said, "You think you've already won, but you don't know the half of it." Her eyes locked on mine, unblinking. "You have no idea who's backing me. This is bigger than you." I didn't respond, just stared at her until she scoffed and walked away. But the words lingered in my head like smoke that wouldn't clear. Back in the courtroom, the second half of the hearing focused on whether enough evidence existed to move forward with a full trial. My attorney argued forcefully, walking through the chain of events, the witness statements, and the forensic evidence that tied everything back to Karen. The defense countered by trying to discredit the witnesses, claiming they were biased due to past disputes with the HOA. But then, in a moment I hadn't seen coming, the prosecutor revealed something new: a text message recovered from Karen's phone, obtained via warrant, in which she told a friend she was finally going to take care of that eyesore. The timestamp: the night before the fire. Karen's attorney immediately tried to spin it as a joke taken out of context, but the damage was done. I could see the judge scribbling notes with more urgency now. As the hearing wrapped up, the judge announced his decision. There was more than sufficient evidence to proceed to trial. Karen's face flushed red, her lips pressed into a thin line, and for the first time I saw genuine panic in her eyes. The bailiff escorted her out alongside her attorney. Then I exhaled slowly, feeling a small but undeniable shift in momentum. Still, I knew this was only the beginning. Outside the courthouse, a small group of reporters had gathered, having caught wind of the case. Microphones and cameras were shoved toward me as questions flew. "Do you think the HOA was involved? Are you seeking damages? What's your response to the defense's claims?" I kept my answers short, focusing on the fact that my home had been destroyed. The evidence pointed to Karen, and I was determined to see justice served. I didn't mention her cryptic hallway threat. That, I decided, was a card I'd keep close to my chest until I knew more. Over the next few days, as my attorney and I prepared for trial, strange things began to happen. A car idled near my temporary apartment late at night before speeding off when I looked out the window. My email inbox filled with spam messages, some of them containing veiled threats. A brick was even thrown through the window of my rental car, though nothing was stolen. Each incident was reported to the police, but without hard proof of who was behind them, there wasn't much they could do. Still, the timing was too perfect to be coincidence. Karen's words about bigger than you echoed in my mind. The day before the trial began, my attorney called with an update that made my stomach drop. Through discovery, they'd uncovered financial transactions linking Karen to a local construction, a developer who had long wanted my property for a commercial project. The same developer had donated heavily to several members of the HOA board, It was a connection that could explain why Karen was so confident and why she might have felt protected enough to commit arson. This wasn't just about a personal vendetta. It was about money, influence, and power. And now, by sheer luck and persistence, we had a trail leading straight to them. That night I barely slept. I kept picturing my home as it had been warm, filled with memories. The smell of fresh coffee in the morning and the sound of rain on the roof, and then seeing it again as it was after the fire, reduced to ash and twisted metal. Tomorrow, I'd walk back into that courtroom, not just to face Karen, but to confront the entire web of people who thought they could erase me and take what they wanted. And this time, I wouldn't just be fighting for justice. I'd be fighting to expose them all. The moment the trial entered its second week, the atmosphere in the courtroom became charged with a tension that seemed to cling to the air itself. The prosecution had already presented an avalanche of evidence, financial statements showing Karen's sudden withdrawals before the fire, text messages hinting at her resentment toward me, and even satellite imagery tracking her car's suspicious movement that night. My attorney, Richard, had been relentless, dissecting every witness's testimony and exposing lies with a calm precision that left Karen visibly agitated. She sat there in her tailored suit, arms crossed, staring at me with an expression that tried to mask both fear and hatred. On the stand, the fire investigator's testimony was a turning point. He spoke in measured tones, explaining how the accelerants used were not random or incidental, but carefully chosen, consistent with an intentional act of arson. His diagrams and photographs made it impossible to believe this was an accident. Karen's legal team squirmed in their seats, trying to pick apart his report, but every rebuttal seemed to collapse under the weight of physical evidence. Then came the testimony of a neighbor I barely knew, a quiet man named Robert, who, turned out, had been out walking his dog the night of the fire. He testified to seeing Karen near my property just before the flames erupted, describing her clothing, her posture, even the way she looked over her shoulder as though checking for witnesses. Richard capitalized on this, weaving Robert's statement into a timeline that fit perfectly with our evidence. Karen's lawyer tried to suggest mistaken identity, but Robert's unwavering certainty was impossible to shake. I watched as Karen shifted in her chair, her nails digging into the armrests, her eyes darting nervously toward the jury. Every so often she would glance at me, as if searching for some sign of weakness, but I gave her nothing. My focus was on the truth, on reclaiming what she had tried to take from me, not just my home, but my peace. The defense tried to regain control by calling Karen to the stand. She entered with an air of defiance, her voice dripping with false sincerity as she claimed to have been home asleep the entire night, unaware of the blaze until the next morning. She painted herself as the victim of a smear campaign, suggesting that the HOA had enemies who were trying to use her as a scapegoat. But Richard was ready. He approached her with a quiet confidence, asking pointed questions that left her flustered. "If you were asleep, Karen, how do you explain the security camera footage showing your car leaving your driveway at 1:42 a.m.? She stammered, muttered something about lending her car to a friend. But when pressed for the friend's name, she claimed not to remember. The courtroom erupted in whispers, and even the judge's eyebrows lifted in disbelief. Richard pressed further, asking why traces of accelerant had been found in her garage in a container matching the brand used to start the fire. She tried to say it was for gardening, but when asked to provide any record of using it for that purpose, she had nothing. The jury watched every moment, their expressions hardening as the inconsistencies piled up. Meanwhile, outside the courthouse, the media swarmed like vultures. Reporters camped out on the steps, eager for any statement, any scrap of drama to feed the evening news. Headlines screamed about the HOA arson scandal, and Karen's face was splashed across every network. Her once carefully curated image of the respectable HOA president was in tatters. In court, we closed the day with a powerful piece of evidence, a recorded phone call Karen had made to an HOA board member just days before the fire. On it, she spoke with venom about how she was done with this fight, and how she would make sure he's out of the neighborhood for good. The implication was undeniable. Karen's lawyer objected, claiming the call was taken out of context, but the damage was done. As court adjourned for the day, I walked out into the cool evening air, feeling a mixture of exhaustion and determination. My friends and family surrounded me, offering quiet encouragement. Richard leaned in and whispered, "She's crumbling. Just a few more days." That night I couldn't sleep. I sat by the window of the small apartment I was renting, staring out at the city lights. The loss of my home still weighed heavily on me, the memories, the years of work, the sense of safety I once felt, but knowing that the truth was coming out gave me strength. I thought about the day the fire happened, the crackling sound of flames, the choking smoke, the cold realization that everything I had built was turning to ash. And now, watching Karen try to twist the narrative to save herself, I knew that this trial was not just about justice. It was about sending a message to anyone who thought they could destroy someone's life and walk away unscathed. The next morning, as I entered the courtroom, Karen wouldn't meet my eyes. She sat hunched over, whispering furiously with her lawyer. I could tell the fight was wearing her down, but I also knew she wasn't going to give up easily. The battle was far from over, but the tide was turning, and I intended to see it through to the very end. As the sixth day of the trial began, the air in the courtroom felt heavier than ever, thick with tension and the weight of everything that had been revealed so far. The press had filled the gallery again, their cameras flashing whenever there was a pause, trying to capture every micro-expression from Karen, from me, from the witnesses, and from the jury. Karen sat in her chair, her posture stiff, her face pulled into a mask of false calm, but the slight tapping of her heel against the floor betrayed the anxiety she tried to conceal. I kept my eyes forward, my hands folded on the table, determined not to give her the satisfaction of even a glance. The prosecution had already lined up today's witnesses, a series of fire investigation experts, forensic analysts, and most importantly, key witness who had not yet taken the stand, the private investigator I had hired just 2 days after the fire. I knew his testimony would connect all the remaining dots in a way that even Karen's expensive defense team couldn't. Dismantle? The first witness was the fire marshal, an older man named Daniel Reeves, who spoke with calm authority. He walked the jury through the final forensic report, the accelerant pattern on the floor, the melted aluminum doorframe indicating intense heat, the clear signs of forced entry before ignition. Karen's defense attorney tried to poke holes, suggesting perhaps it was an accidental electrical fire or a gas leak. But Reeves shut each theory down with precise explanations and photographs. Then came the forensic lab technician who explained how the accelerant residue matched the brand purchased in cash by a woman whose build and movements matched Karen's on store surveillance video, though the woman was wearing a hoodie and hat. To obscure her identity, that was when the defense tried another tactic, implying that the footage was inconclusive and could have been anyone. But the technician calmly pointed out that the woman's posture, stride, and even her distinctive way of carrying her left arm matched Karen perfectly, especially when compared with unrelated HOA meeting footage. You could feel the defense team's frustration growing with each answer. Then, the moment came for the private investigator, Thomas Gray, to take the stand. He had been in the gallery for days, listening quietly, but now he carried a large black case to the witness stand. I remember the day I hired him. He was a retired law enforcement officer with a reputation for thoroughness and a knack for catching details others missed. Thomas was sworn in, then carefully opened his case and began producing high-resolution photographs, receipts, and printed screenshots from social media posts that Karen had deleted, posts recovered through his data retrieval methods. The prosecution guided him to explain how he had tailed Karen in the weeks leading up to the fire, noting multiple suspicious visits to my street. A meeting with an unknown man in a dark SUV who later turned out to have a criminal record for arson, and a pattern of late-night drives near my home just days before the fire. The jury leaned forward as he described how GPS metadata from her phone, obtained legally through a subpoena, placed her near my property the exact night the blaze started. Karen shifted in her seat, her lips pressing together until they turned white. The defense objected repeatedly, claiming that Thomas's surveillance was invasive and unreliable. But the judge overruled them each time, reminding them that the methods used were lawful and the evidence relevant. Then Thomas dropped the final bombshell: security footage from a neighbor's backyard camera, positioned just far enough down the street to catch Karen's car driving past my house minutes before the flames erupted. and then again racing away. In the opposite direction, the courtroom was silent, except for the faint hum of the ceiling fan, when cross-examination came. The defense tried to undermine Thomas by suggesting his years in law enforcement might have biased him against HOA-related cases, but Thomas didn't flinch. "I don't take sides," he said evenly. "I take facts. And the facts here point directly to the defendant." The prosecution ended the day's witness list with a financial analyst who traced a suspicious withdrawal from Karen's bank account. 2 days before the fire, the exact amount later used to pay the man in the SUV, who was now serving time for an unrelated charge. The link between them was still circumstantial, but when stacked alongside everything else, it painted a damning picture. By the time court adjourned for the day, the jurors looked grim, almost sympathetic toward me. And Karen's once smug demeanor had completely evaporated. As I gathered my documents, I caught a glimpse of her whispering urgently to her lawyer, her eyes darting toward the door as if already imagining an escape route. That night, I didn't sleep much. The case was tilting heavily in our favor, but I knew Karen was unpredictable, and her defense might pull a last-minute stunt to sway the jury. I sat at my kitchen table, the soft glow of the desk lamp spilling over the stacks of evidence, and thought about everything this trial represented, not just justice for me, but for every neighbor she had terrorized, every person she had manipulated. With HOA power and every victim of her spite, I thought about my home, reduced to ashes, the walls that once echoed with laughter, now just a memory. And I promised myself again that I wouldn't stop until she faced the full weight of the law. Tomorrow would be the defense's turn to call witnesses, and I knew they would try to discredit me entirely, perhaps even spin a narrative where I was the villain. But I was ready. The truth had been laid out, piece by piece, and no matter how they twisted it, the jury had seen the full picture. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that Karen wasn't finished yet, that she had one last card to play, and that when she played it, it would be ugly. I closed the files, exhaled slowly, and told myself that whatever happened in that courtroom tomorrow, I would meet it head-on. The tension in the courtroom was suffocating, every breath feeling heavier as the judge glanced over his notes and then looked directly at Karen, who sat stiffly in her chair, her lips pressed together like she was holding back another outburst. The gallery was packed neighbors from our HOA, people from the town, even a few reporters who had caught wind of the trial's bizarre twist. The irony of it all wasn't lost on anyone. A woman who had spent years hiding behind HOA bylaws and petty complaints was now sitting under the unblinking gaze of a court, facing charges for the most unthinkable act she could commit. I kept my own expression steady, though deep down, a storm churned. Every image of my home in flames replayed in my mind. Every late night I'd woken up to phantom smells of smoke. Every time I had to explain to my kids why we no longer had the place they grew up in, it was all there, bubbling beneath the surface, pushing me to see this through no matter what. When the prosecutor stood, the silence was sharp enough to cut. "Your Honor, the evidence presented here over the past weeks has made one thing abundantly clear. This was no accident, and it was no misunderstanding. It was a deliberate act, carried out with malice." He gestured to the screen where grainy security footage was frozen on the image of Karen just moments before the fire. The defendant was caught on camera walking around the property with a gas can. We have eyewitnesses, forensic analysis, and even the defendant's own words recorded when she threatened the victim only days prior. This was premeditated. I didn't need to look at the footage again. I'd memorized every frame. Even memorized the way she walked, with that same entitled strut she used when patrolling the HOA streets, like every inch of land belonged to her. Karen's attorney rose next, voice dripping with faux sympathy. "Ladies and gentlemen, my client is a respected member of her community. Yes, there was a fire. Yes, she was in the area. But coincidences happen. There's no concrete proof that she lit the match." He painted a picture of Karen as a victim of circumstance, someone caught up in gossip, fueled hysteria stirred by a neighborhood feud. I almost laughed at the absurdity, except this was my reality, not some courtroom drama on TV. The jury watched both sides with expressions I couldn't read, their faces masks of neutrality. The judge called for a recess, giving everyone a chance to breathe before closing arguments wrapped up. I stepped outside, inhaling the cool air, letting it fill my lungs and slow my racing thoughts. Across the street, reporters whispered, their cameras ready. People still stopped me, offering condolences or muttering how they never thought Karen was capable of such a thing, though many admitted they'd seen her temper before. Some even confessed she had bullied them in smaller ways over the years' fines. For imaginary violations, threats to report them for nonsense infractions. She had cultivated fear in our neighborhood for so long that some people almost seemed relieved. She had finally been caught doing something undeniable. When we reconvened, it was my turn to take the stand again. The prosecutor asked me to recount that night in detail one final time. My voice was steady as I described the first wisp of smoke, the frantic call to 911, the helplessness as I watched flames swallow decades of memories. I made sure to emphasize that this wasn't about HOA disputes anymore. It was about someone believing they had the right to destroy everything I owned, someone acting as if consequences didn't apply to them. Karen stared at me the whole time, her expression somewhere between rage and smugness, like she still believed she could walk out of here untouched. Then came the moment we'd all been waiting for. The jury filed back in. The foreman's hands trembled slightly as he unfolded the slip of paper.
Ow.
My heart pounded in my chest. We, the jury, find the defendant, Karen Whitfield, guilty on all counts. The words echoed in the room. For a moment, Karen didn't move. Then, as if realizing this was real, she turned to her attorney, whispering frantically. The judge's gavel struck. Bailiff, take the defendant into custody. Shackles clicked around her wrists, and for the first time since this ordeal began, I saw something break in her eyes, a flash of fear. She was led away, her head down, and I knew this wasn't the end of my journey, but it was the end of hers as the tyrant of our neighborhood. Reporters swarmed me outside, their questions coming rapid fire, but I just told them the truth. Justice was served. And if anyone thinks they can burn someone's life to the ground and walk away, they're wrong. The community's reaction was almost surreal. Some celebrated openly, others stayed quiet, perhaps wary of what would happen next. But one thing was certain: Karen's reign was over. Even the HOA board, once loyal to her, was now facing its own reckoning as investigations began into their shady dealings. The insurance claim on my home was still working its way through. Rebuilding would take time, but I felt something I hadn't in months' peace. I knew the road ahead wasn't just about rebuilding my house, but about making sure nothing like this could happen again, not to me, not to anyone else. And as I stood there watching the courthouse steps empty, I felt the weight lift. But deep down, I also knew that stories like this had a way of sticking to a place, of lingering in whispers and half-told tales at barbecues and block parties. Somewhere out there, another Karen was already planning her next move in some other neighborhood. That's why I'm telling this story, because people need to see what happens when someone decides they're above the law, when they push too far. And if you think this is where the chaos ends, you're wrong.
Ears.
More, always more. Subscribe to the Sham Stories YouTube channel because you won't believe what happened next.